Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us at this rather unusual 3 p.m. hour here at the Korea Society. But we were delighted. The second we put it up, we had 35 people sign up because the book is very much worthwhile. And that book is indeed Fault Lines in a Rising Asia by Professor and Ambassador Chung Min Lee. Chung Min is known, I think, to several of us in the room in the analysis community as really one of the thought leaders who has bridged both American and Korean context. And he's really an individual with an extraordinary background, an extraordinary global exposure. He has been with us here at the Korea Society before. He's here for a private discussion tomorrow that we're doing with representatives from Korea, China, Japan, and the United States, that organized by the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And so we were thrilled that we could take advantage of Chung Min's presence to be here today and to present the book just shortly after its release. Dr. Lee has also, I think, done us a great service. I will be up at Columbia in the fall and spring of next year. This will certainly be on the reading list, and I think is destined probably for many university lists around the country as an amazingly comprehensive overview of where Asia sits now. And many of the thoughts in it consolidate in a way that is perhaps a bit different than some of the discourse has led us to think over the course of the noughts and the teens here. And I'll let Chung Min explain why. But Chung Min, thank you for taking the time today, and congratulations on the release. Congratulations, we saw you in the Washington Post on Monday with a major feature, and happy that the book is getting the attention it well deserves.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be back in the Korea Society, and I'd like to really have an intimate discussion with the audience today. And the major reason that I wrote this book was because I thought that 98% of the discourse on Asia was, at least in the English community, was written by American scholars or American watchers of Asia. And I asked myself, why is it that Asians don't write many books? I'm sure they write in English on cultural and social and other aspects. But at least in foreign policy, I found that the community was quite small. And part of the reason is because most Asian scholars, whether you're Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Southeast Asian, they have a tendency to focus almost exclusively on the countries of their origin. And so you'll have Korean scholars writing almost exclusively on Korean issues, Japanese on exclusively Japanese, Indian on exclusively Indian. And so there was a lack, I thought, of an Asian scholar who would be able to write a much more broader picture of what's happening in Asia. The second reason why I wrote this book, and that's part of the in the introduction, is that much of what we hear about Asia's rise is not wrong, in my opinion, but I think it's very incomplete. It's incomplete because much of the Asian story is what I would call a Horatio Alger story. It's a story about Asia's rags to riches, the post-war Japanese success, followed by the Four Tigers, and then you have China's rise, and most recently, the rise of India. And if you have all of that together, that's a very compelling story, but it doesn't really tell you all the problems that Asia faces. And as I tell my students, Asia is not only the magnet of the world's growth, it is also home to almost all the world's problems, whether it's political, whether it's social, whether it's economic or demographic. Every major problem that the world has, you can see also the problems here in Asia. The third, I guess, major stream of this book is I thought, well, what happens after Asia rises? And obviously no country or no region can rise forever. But after Asia has arisen, you have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of Asia? And it's not making more cell phones or making more cars or making greater, I guess, inventions. That's one part of the story. And my personal view is that after Asia rises, you have to do a lot more for the global commons. And you have to really address human rights issues. You've got to address climate change issues. You've got to address economic inequality issues. And if you look at it from that perspective, Asia has done its share of contributing to the global commons, but not nearly as much as it should. And if you look at, for example, let's take one critical issue these days, the Syrian refugee crisis. Regardless of the origin of the Syrian civil war, the fact remains that you have over 450,000 plus people who have been killed in the Syrian civil war. And it is a huge issue for European security, obviously. It's a huge issue for the Middle East. But it also impacts Asia. But I think you'll find a very limited number of Asian scholars or Asian leaders who have spoken out on the horrible, I guess, carnage, for lack of a better word, of what's happening in Syria today. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that Asian leaders don't pay attention to global issues? And I think part of it is because of their upbringing, part of it is their very myopic DNA, and part of it is they're just more interested in what's happening within Asia. And the fourth and last strand of my book was, okay, if you look at almost all the big problems, it is nearly impossible to say one particular issue is entirely nationalistic. Every single major Asian issue is transnational. If you look at political deficits, I would argue that China faces the biggest political problem in the next 20, 30 years. Here you have a very successful Communist Party. It has delivered unparalleled economic, I guess, progress to its citizens. But at the same time, you have a one-party state running the world's second largest economy. And at some point in time, I believe that simply won't be tenable, for the next 30, 40 years. Then if you look at almost all the democracies in Asia, Japan and South Korea, for example, face humongous demographic challenges. Japan and South Korea are the world's fastest aging societies and also the fastest shrinking societies. So in the next 30, 40 years, the demographics simply are very negative for Japan and South Korea. And that will have, I would argue, repercussions for their, foreign policy choices. And so, again, that's a transnational problem. If you look at all the political deficits, the military competition, you take the South China Sea, you take the Indo-Pakistani nuclear confrontation, if you look at the inter-Korean relationship, every one of these very large geopolitical, I guess, problems have, as I said, transnational footprints. So unless Asians can come together, it's very difficult for me to imagine a world whereby Asia is quote unquote one Asia. And my last note on this before I, ask Steve to take over is that I am very proud to be Asian, very proud to be Korean, and very proud of all the progress Asia has made. But I think it is time that Asia also really, really understood the problems that it also has created. And I don't buy the argument that Asia is not right for democracy or somehow Asians are not fit for a free society, because the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Taiwanese, and now the Indonesians have shown that Asia can be wealthy and free. And so despite the fact that there is cultural uniqueness and there are, of course, very broad historical reasons, I would argue that Asian values, quote unquote, is not the future of Asia. The future of Asia lies, I would argue, very squarely in the field of universal values. So let me stop there, Steve,
Sure.
and then I'll be more than glad to take questions from the floor and or from you, as the case may be.
Oh, thank you, Chung Min. And that was very bold and very concise. And you've given us a lot to think about just with your introduction. In the book, you use an interesting tagline. And sometimes as I read through books, I try to grab for what would be the great T-shirt slogan. And one of the ones you use is that Asia's a supermarket for
Department store.
Department store. I'm sorry.
Right.
Department store for conflicts. And I was wondering if you could basically outline it, because I think one of the things you do here that's novel is you bring in the three main flashpoints over the course of the book: the Korean Peninsula, North Korea. Obviously, we spend a lot of time here at the Korea Society on that particular issue. The Taiwan issue, which is now back on the board, and the Chinese have expressed consternation in terms of President Tsai's assumption of office and where things may go. And then you very interestingly bring in the Indo-Pacific or Indo-Asian equation, in particular the Kashmir crisis, and real concerns that you feel we should have over the India-Pakistan situation. And as much as we all spend time talking about China, you remind us that the failed states of North Korea and Pakistan really are things that deserve much greater attention.
Well, I coined that phrase because if you look at almost all the, I guess, huge military and security problems that Asia faces, the magnitude is without parallel in the world. You have Syria, you have unrest in Libya, you have turmoil in other parts of Northern Africa. There are issues in the Ukraine and Crimea, and of course, the resurgence of Russian, I guess, military policy. Those are all critical issues. But if you look at the magnitude, the weight, none of them compare to the problems that Asia has. So if you look at great power rivalries, obviously US, China is one big snippet of this. You have the Chinese competing with the Japanese in the East China Sea. You have the Chinese competing with other Asian navies across Southeast Asia. You have, of course, the Chinese competing with the Indians. That's just one facet of this. The other is the fact that if you look at the nuclear issue, I am very concerned about North Korea, but I'm even more concerned about what's happening in Pakistan. And I believe firmly that although I am not a South Asian specialist, I've been to India, I've been to Pakistan, and I think the level of control that Pakistani government has, in particular the Pakistani armed forces has over its nuclear forces, remains fairly robust today, but things could change down the road. And so that's one big area of concern. As one professor says, a prominent Pakistani expert, C. Kristen Fair at Georgetown, she said, quote, I'm paraphrasing her, she said, Pakistan is an army pretending to be a country. And I think that really has a parallel because, when I read that and I thought, gosh, the other country that does that in a very good way, in its own way, is North Korea. So you have these two very important, strategically crucial Asian states that are in many respects failed or nearly failed states, have nuclear weapons, but they're basically run by the armed forces. And then you have if you look at the number of modern weapon systems, arms imports, defense spending trends, in 2011, something very important happened. Asia spent more money on defense than Europe did. And this trend, I think, will continue over the next 10, 15 years. So even with a slowing Chinese economy, there's no doubt in my mind that the world's biggest arms importers are all going to be in this region. And then you face, for example, political military problems that are very crucial. For example, what will happen to the regime in Myanmar? How long will the Thai government remain, under military rule? So these are all issues that are in Asia, but will have huge repercussions because, as I said, the sheer magnitude is different from any other region here, on the planet.
I'd like to pursue two strains there. One is you do a very nice job here of pulling together what we know about the Pakistan-North Korea equation,
Right.
as much as we're talking about them in terms of two entities about which we should be concerned. Could you speak to the issue of the transfer and the AQ Khan effect, et cetera, and why it's important to look back at that and understand
I think
that?
over the course of my research, almost all the materials on the Pakistani nuclear program or in the Indian nuclear program are weak because they're all based on secondary sources. You have a small number of national intelligence estimates that have been released, but these are very, very old and few and far between. But there are a number of really good secondary sources. And one that I found out was that according to a number of analysts who have tracked this issue for many years, the origins of the Pakistani nuclear program begins when the Chinese first transferred nuclear arms technology to the Pakistanis. And that happened, they expect around 1980, 1982, somewhere in that time frame. And if that is true, then why did China transfer nuclear arms technology to the Pakistanis? Well, for a number of reasons. When India tested its bomb in 1974, Pakistan's AQ Khan, who was then working in the Netherlands, came back to Pakistan and told Prime Minister Bhutto at that time that he would really want to make a bomb for Pakistan. And of course, Prime Minister Bhutto was very happy. And so AQ Khan comes back to Pakistan, sets up Khan laboratories, and then he begins not only an indigenous program, but begins to also sell, as you all know, WMD-related technologies to Syria, to Iraq. He dabbled in Libya. But one of the big things that they did was this missiles for nuclear technology barter trade with North Korea. And in one of the anecdotes that I found out, when his daughter, who was also assassinated, Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, she visits North Korea in 1990. I can't remember the exact date, in the early 1990s when she was first prime minister. And the Pakistani army tells her, I want you to go to Pyongyang and ask North Korea, please give us the blueprints for the Nodong missiles. And so she goes to Pyongyang, sits next to Kim Il Sung over a state dinner. And then after the state dinner, she says, well, Mr. President, I have one wish, which is I want you to give us the blueprints for the Nodong. And Kim Il Sung, according to this source, is very, very surprised. But then he instructs his people to help. And so when she leaves, she brings with her a whole bag full of CDs that has the blueprint. And so that is when the relationship begins. And so Pakistan not only did lots of damage to Indian-Pakistani relations, but she also did a lot of damage to, for example, Korean security, simply because of the fact that you had this WMD collaboration between Pakistan and North Korea.
Yeah. And when you outline that, then I think it helps us to understand why when Sig Ecker of Stanford walks in 2010 and sees 1,000+ centrifuges, how they got to that point,
Right.
and that we shouldn't be as surprised. And to borrow from some of the arguments made by out at Monterey on the West Coast, perhaps we've been underestimating the North Koreans because of this. I just want to kind of whet people's appetite with a few of these types of questions because they can go more into detail within the book. But I would like to pick up then a second strain, which is you do talk, you've just mentioned Myanmar, and you mention the situation by way of Malaysia and hybrid democracies. And it's interesting because a lot of us here are very quick to point to South Korea, perhaps to Taiwan, and talk about the vibrancy of Asian democracies. But you point out the challenges to democracy and the uncertainties around some of the legacies of authoritarianism. And I wondered if you wanted to go into that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, nobody has a perfect history of democracy, certainly not the U.S., if you see what's happening in the U.S. election these days. But on the other hand, you have to ask yourself, what is the Asian record on democratization? And I would think that you have Japan that's done fairly well since 1945, but democracy in that sense was imposed on the Japanese after World War II. And I think Japan has been a model democracy, in my opinion. And then you had South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, which were all formerly authoritarian states run by military strongmen, and over time they transitioned to democracy. It's been a very volatile transition in some ways, but in those countries it basically has worked. And I think if people ask me, is it possible to envision South Korea going back to military rule? I would say zero. Chances are zero. I think one of the great things that has happened since '87 is that the South Korean army accepts 100% civilian control. And there's no way that, in my opinion, that's going to go back. But we had very high hopes for Thailand, for example. And yet, over the last 10 years, you've had 2 military coups. And this regime in Bangkok today, I think, will be in power for quite some time. And in Myanmar, you see a transition from the military to Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD. Her party has the largest majority in parliament. She is now a member of the cabinet. But you have to ask yourself, the army still reserves 25% of the seats in parliament by rule, and I don't think they'll give up power anytime soon, right? So you have very spotty records in those countries. And then you have hybrid democracies, in particular Singapore and Malaysia, but in particular Malaysia. And so you've had UMNO that's been in power since independence. You have the PAP that's been in power since independence. And in the post-Lee Kuan Yew era, I think Singapore is moving towards a more liberal state, but in many respects, it has, quote unquote, its own Singaporean model. And that's something that I think Southeast Asian states will have to find out. How fast should Singapore become, quote unquote, a full democracy? And these are all questions that are bubbling up, but none greater, in my view, Steve, than the future of China. Nobody in this room, I certainly am not a China specialist, but if you look at the future of Chinese politics, I think President Xi Jinping's biggest threat is not from the Chinese or the Japanese or other powers. It is from his own people. It is from the millions and millions of educated, economically well-off, globalized Chinese citizens who understand how the world is run. And they will be able to see, for example, that China's future, I hope, doesn't remain in a one-party Leninist system, but that at some point in time, China may not be a Western democracy or multi-party democracy, but I think China should, I hope, become a more liberal state. And that's one thing. And in the book, I also mentioned in passing what's happening in Hong Kong. And I think Hong Kong, in many respects, is becoming, unfortunately, more illiberal over the last several years than I expected. So the pace of Chinese influence in Hong Kong is much more rapid than I would have imagined.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me about your Washington Post piece on Monday is it comes out in a week when President Obama starts in Vietnam, ends in Hiroshima. And in particular on the Vietnam side, I think what you've just said by way of transitions of political systems, the question marks some human rights and other American and international observers have made about where Vietnam is and what the president is trying to do, the lifting of the arms embargo, and then how that figures relative to the counter to China. So your book comes out at really a very astute time, and I wonder if you might reflect on the president's visit, the implications, and any larger observations on U.S. rebalance.
Many years ago, I think a British journalist asked me a question. He said, amongst all the countries in Asia, which country do you fear the most? I thought, God, that's a really difficult question. So I said, if you had to fight a war, I said, I would not fight a war with the Vietnamese. Because, the French tried and they lost, and the Americans tried and they lost, and the Chinese tried briefly and they lost. So unless you are really eager for a fight, I said, don't get the Vietnamese angry. But this is a country where I believe, I'm a big fan of Vietnam, Steve, because if I had to look into the future and say which two countries in Southeast Asia will become real trendsetters in the next 30, 40 years, it is without a doubt in my mind, Indonesia and Vietnam. Vietnam, because it is a country that has 90 million people, very young demographics, and it is, I think, in many respects, the most pragmatic country in Asia. And I say this because imagine for 30, 40 years, you fight a colonial war with the French. Then you fight 15 years of a very, very difficult, bloody war with the Americans. And as you know, South Korea had the second largest foreign troop contingent in Vietnam. And after all that, and this is a communist government that has been in power since 1975, and one of Vietnam's largest foreign direct investors are Korean companies. In fact, Vietnam has had enormous and very surprising, very deep economic ties with Korean firms. And you have to ask yourself, a generation ago, they were fighting each other in the jungles. And now they're welcoming back Koreans as huge investors. Korean is a very popular language in Vietnamese educational schools. And of course, when President Obama went to Vietnam, a very successful trip, why are the Vietnamese welcoming Barack Obama with open arms? It's because of one word, the rise of China. And I think if the Vietnamese look at the next 30, 40 years, they think, okay, if China rises even at this pace, there's no way that Vietnam will ever catch up with China. There's no way that India will ever catch up with China. And so the best way for the Vietnamese to protect their sovereignty and to upgrade their security is to join hands with their former enemy. And this is why I believe the Vietnamese are a very, very pragmatic, very, very difficult, in that sense, hard people to read, but they have their core national interests at heart. So in that sense, as I said, those are the two powers that I think are crucial. And Barack Obama is finishing his term And his pivot to Asia is being finished with this visit to Vietnam and, of course, onwards to Hiroshima. So in that sense, I think this really not completes the circle, but it is nearly complete from the record that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years.
Mm. There's been coverage, the Financial Times and others, that many in South Korea are concerned about the Hiroshima visit.
Mm.
And given all that you've written about in this book on the nuclear
Right.
issue, how do you look at it?
You know, I think you have to separate political with humanitarian issues. And there were thousands of South Korean or Koreans who were killed in the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I hope President Obama will also mention them when he goes to Hiroshima and remembers the war dead. And I think his visit is being received politically in Korea in very sensitive ways. And I can understand it as a Korean. But I think Barack Obama is going there for purely humanitarian reasons. He wants to go there. He's not apologizing for what the U.S. did in World War II. He's not saying this was a bad thing. But as you recall, he began his presidency with this long-term vision of a world without nuclear weapons. And I think, you know, Secretary Kerry became the first Secretary of State to visit Hiroshima a few months back. And Barack Obama is going to be the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima. So I would see this visit, as I said, from that perspective, which is we want to make sure that the world remembers all the people who suffered in World War II, including those who were killed in Hiroshima. But this in no way negates the fact that, you know, we're not revisiting history. Obama is not saying, well, as a result, I'm apologizing to the Japanese. I think the press, both in Korea and elsewhere, may be reading a bit too much into that.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Let me ask you one last presidential trip, and then we'll turn to the audience, and that is the centerpiece of the trip really is the G7.
Right.
And China has expressed its concerns that it feels excluded, and that G20 is the way of the future, and G7 is a symbol of the past. Where do you see this relative to all that you write about in terms of where we should think about and what we should think about relative to China?
I mean, whether it's the G7 or the G10 or the G20, whatever G it is, at some point in time, history will decide if the G7 has to be remodeled. And as you recall, Steve, until a few years ago, it was the G8, until Russia was kicked out because of what they did in Crimea and the Ukraine. And, you know, did Russia suffer because of this? Maybe in some ways, but I don't think it really dented Russia's core strategic interests. So the G7 doesn't run the world. The G7 was an economic club that was founded in the 70s. It grew as a political body. It reached, I think, its height back in the 80s. But do people really seriously believe that in this day and age, the G7 is as important as it was before? And the answer is clearly not. But it is a meeting of, quote unquote, like-minded states. And so you have a group of like-minded states that decide on economic issues. But I think the world is much more complex for 7 countries to sit down every year and decide what the menu of the week is. So at some point in time, China will be included, not only in the G7, but some type of a forum like the G7. But that really depends on the Chinese and what they espouse to be as a great power. And so if you look at the AIIB, OBOR, and so forth, the Chinese are having a much greater stake in the world system. But at some point in time, they may want to say, okay, we want a more direct role in managing the world. But if that day should come, the Chinese also have to make sure that they play a much bigger role in terms of responsibilities for the global commons. But anyway, Steve, it's always a pleasure to be back at the Korea Society. And let me thank you and all the great staff at the Korea Society for making this happen.
Thank you. Thank you to Professor Chung Min Lee. And we would like to thank all of you for taking the time to be with us today, for your insightful questions, for your thoughts. And this is the end of our free week programming. We've offered you 3 programs in the last week to mark our annual gala. And to incentivize you, please join the Korea Society at koreasociety.org or find out more about our programs there. We resume with actually the conclusion of our policy season next Thursday with David Kahn of USC. And we hope to see some, if not all of you, back then for a Thursday evening discussion. And I would ask you lastly to please take the time to fill out the survey. It does help our program team know where to make improvements and how things are going. And please, on your way out, if you are keen, since this was a free program, you will find few better reads this year than Chung Min Lee's Fault Lines in a Rising Asia. We do have copies for sale. We make nothing off of the books. It actually is through the very generous courtesy of the Carnegie Endowment, and they have sent the books up here. And we do hope that you're able to purchase, and Professor Lee will sign them to you. So thank you so much.
Don't force people to buy books. It's okay.
It's okay. Or go to Amazon or your iPhone. I have it on my iPhone and my iPad. So thank you very much, and again, a round of applause for Chung Min Lee.